Hello, everyone. This will be a Zoom lecture on the PowerPoint, the Reclamation of Science. This is going to be coming on the heels of the video called The Rise and Fall of Science. Now, the information in this little Zoom overview will be just the same as you're going to have in the regular PowerPoint with the built-in audio files. Just many people find it better if I do a voice over PowerPoint versus having those individual sound files, because I know they can be actually problematic. That's sort of, antiquated sort of technology, and it's sort of hard to rewind those. So if you'd rather, not have to do that, I'm going to give you another option here. So let's jump into the Reclamation of Science. Okay, so Reclamation of Science, which implies it was lost, and that's where we left the last video lecture at, when the origin of science actually happened in the early Islamic empires, and it was lost at the top of the golden age of the Islamic empires, roughly around 1278 to 1280, which is really the last fall, the political fall, which was engendered by the Crusades, the European Crusades, and also by the war campaigns of Genghis Khan, which essentially destroyed the intellectual center of the world at that time, which was centered around the city of Baghdad, where modern day Iraq is. And of course, at that period of time, there were no, nationalistic lines like Iraq, and Kuwait. Those actually didn't exist, right? It was just a large Persian empire and many kingdoms that were involved in it. All right, so not to belabor that any further, let's figure out, how science was brought back to us, because obviously so much of our world right now, is infused with products of science. My favorite here, of course, is, the cell phone. We call these things high technology, but really what we're talking about are products of scientific thinking. And I'm sitting in my room right now, and it's hard for me to find out, even any of the materials here that haven't been brought to me and to our world by experimentation and the scientific process. All right. So the basic way in which science was brought back to the world was sort of, a serendipitous sort of activity by chance by Irish monks. That the works that the Islamic folks produced together were always bound in very wonderful books. And if you've seen old books with like gold leaf around them, the gold illuminations, this is how books were put together. They were actually works of art, very carefully done. And when the mercenaries came in, many of the crusaders came in. Of course, many of them were actually very wealthy. They were from they're from the aristocracy. Many of them weren't either. They were unpaid sort of mercenaries. And to keep morale high, while a lot of looting was prohibited, they didn't want to do too much. That was a Christian sort of sin to do that, even though there was a lot of bloodshed. There were rules of war. The Holy Roman Empire would let soldiers bring back things which they thought were of value. And many soldiers thought that books were of value because of the gold illuminations around them. They could take these things down and smelt them down, and at least get some money out of it. So they were carting back lots of books back to Europe. But of course, when they went to the marketplace, they found these things, were valueless or just almost not worth taking back, until Irish monks, began to hear about these new texts, these new sort of information, that were out there, and they were very interested in learning about things. The monks, of course, what kind of life does a monk have, especially in the dark, dingy the conditions of Ireland? I lived in Ireland for quite a while. It's pretty dark and dingy. So the Irish monks were going over to markets, buying this Islamic text, which are full of all sorts of interesting knowledge, and including scientific knowledge, taking them back and translating them from Arabic into Latin. And they were, building up their own sort of archives of books. This is what they were doing, and they did this for over 100 years. 100 years. So how do all these translated books get back into the European marketplace? Well, one thing about Europe at this time is that there were a lot of setbacks that were happening. We had the plague going on for a long period of time. We had a lot of feudal warring going on for a long period of time. But in the end, wealth was beginning to sort of accumulate in Europe. The feudal system, as barbaric as I would consider it, it was one in which produced a tax revenue for many local rulers, and it did provide a way in which to build better schools. And they started to produce the first sort of universities. And these first universities needed books. And a lot of the books were supplied by the Irish monks. And many of those books were from the former Islamic empires, and they had ways of thinking scientifically in them, including the star of the show. If you remember from the very first slide I showed you on the rise and fall of science, good old Alhazen himself. All right, so the monks here again, of course, here's a couple illuminations here of the Crusades and the Irish monks coming across the sea on their little holy activities to get the books, to bring them back. And what they do is they begin to sell them to nascent, universities. And here's just a small list. You can see that the time periods in which they're being built: Oxford, 1214, Padua, Naples, of course, these are all the Italian areas, which will be going through their own renaissance soon. So these books become extremely important, as we'll see later on. Cambridge University, Toulouse, in France. So, they're coming at a time where, the Irish monks have had time to, translate them into Latin, been stored. Universities begin to effervesce, and now they're buying these books from the monks. Now, here's the thing about these books and what they're getting is that the faculty are charged with going through the books to figure out which are appropriate and which are inappropriate for learning, which should be disseminated to public and to students, because many of these universities were scholastic sort of universities. And they're not like we have now. They're not just open forums for all sorts of discussion. These things are places where there's a lot of, clergy go there to learn, how to become, parishioners, to get degrees in divinity. A lot of times we're learning about, basic things about law and just some basic basic skills, but nothing that you would consider, a high level intellectual enterprise, and particularly nothing that would go against the thinkings of the church. So many of the books that you're going to get from the Islamic Empire do that. They're violating, they're borderlining on heresy. Thus, they're kept, down in the bookstores, locked up away from the general population. But here's one of the things about that: when you hide things from people, you automatically know what's going to happen. Someone's going to try to go in and get whatever is hidden. If you watch the Harry Potter series, is exactly what's happening. And Rollins is trying to say that too, that when you're hiding the secret knowledge, someone, especially the students, are going to go try to find it. They're going to go down below the school where all the secret knowledge is there, and illumination, of course, will happen. But of course, all sorts of terrible people are going to try to press you to keep you from getting this knowledge. Well, this is an allegory of these periods of time. So let's figure out, who was trying to get the knowledge first. I think it's very important, for us to know a little bit about this, especially in modern times. Here is a little image that was done in roughly around 1330. And it's the university, I believe, we think this one is of France. It's University of Paris. University of Paris. And if you look at the class, who's out there, who the students are, really what you're looking at is sort of a mixed blend of men and women, in these classrooms. Now, here's the interesting thing. Within a generation after this, you're not going to see another woman in a university for probably 250 to 300 years. They're literally banished from all universities in Europe. And one of the reasons is those books, and I'm going to tell you quite frankly, is that the one thing you never tell a woman, I'll tell you, is no. Whatever you do, don't tell them no. You can suggest things. Maybe you shouldn't, maybe. But when you tell someone, a woman, don't do that, you have a problem. Because that's one you should never tell women to go do things. That's just terrible. That's a horrible thing to do, right? But for women, that's like a challenge. And women are the women are finding all this knowledge. Many of this stuff has been coveted by males. And in fact, most of the knowledge of learning is better than what the establishment has already. So women are becoming better than men. They're becoming better at medicine. They understand society better, become better sociologists, I would guess, better psychologists. They understand process is better. And they're challenging the male authority. And as soon as science lets them do that, knowledge lets them do that, but bam, they're shut down. Not only they're not allowed to go to schools anymore, they're charged with witchcraft. I mean, witchcraft was rampant at this period of time because women were learning about the real world around us. And in fact, from about this time period up for the next 150, 100 years, we estimate somewhere between 2 and 3 million women died by witchcraft accusations, either by direct killing or under torture. It was horrific. Now, at this time period too, though, while we have a lot of terrible things happen, a lot of oppression going on, And certainly that's a consideration with women. There's also some bright lights being shed, here or there before science is going to make its grand sort of like release across Europe once again. That in some ways you can't stop people from thinking scientifically because that's the only way to get to the truth. And you have to live in a world where you get to the truth or nothing actually sort of advances. So you have people coming up with some very interesting ideas, not scientific, but are in that sort of direction. Here's an example. William of Ockham, right? And there's his time period, 1287 to 1347, which places us in the same period where there's all this conflict going on with the women, right? In the universities and witchcraft accusations. And William says this, without talking about heresy. He starts in with his principle of parsimony. And this is the thing he said. Think about this. If someone tells you, there's two theories about how something happens. One's really complicated and one's really simple. Which one do you choose? Simplest one. The simplest explanation is usually the most correct. And that would be the way I think I would comparing like a Greek explanation for something. They keep going on and on and on and on and on and on and say nothing. But if you really want to say something about reality, it can be done short and sweet. Because that's the way nature is. There's the underlying rules of nature are generally very simple. And that's what he was trying to get across to us, right? Simple explanations are always the correct ones. Next thing he said is that you shouldn't posit anything, put anything out there without a reason given. In other words, why something happened. Really why, the reason, understanding the underlying cause of something. You have to know it by seeing it, knowing that it happens. Not knowing by it comes out of a book, not by what somebody else says, not by magic, not by anything else, but surely on physical grounds only. And that's truly sort of the precipice, the very beginnings of what it takes in a society to begin to embrace science, as it reemerges again as an actual procedure. And with this type of thinking, the procedure is ready to be adopted. Again, we just need someone to bring it into full view. Well, let's go to that person. And of course, during this time period too, it's not going very well. William Ocker back here, was of a growing community who was beginning to think like that. But the Black Plague came in, the bubonic plague came in. It basically eliminated a huge portion of Europe. I would say the figures here between 30 and 60% of the population, it was certainly higher than 60% in urban areas, big cities. And that's really where you have the smart people at. The well-learned people are, of course, going to be in the higher population centers, which are going to suffer for the Black Death more. So that really does put a suppression on science, coming back. And that's why we're not going to see it really effloresce for at least another 150 years. This Black Plague really put a dampener on things. Well, you can't keep science down because eventually it must come back. So how does it happen? This guy right here, guy by the name of Nikolaus Copernicus. In fact, I'll give you a little picture of him right there. Here's Nikolai. So we'll go back to the other side. Want to have a look. This is the only drawing we actually have of Nikolaus Copernicus. So what did he do? Well, he was one of these guys who he actually ended up in Italy studying. And Italy at this time was going through a renaissance. In other words, you were freer to look at things. No one's going to be looking over your shoulder or questioning why you're reading some text or nothing, or banishing you or giving you a punishment. So really the book archives are more open. So Copernicus is down there very interested, in celestial mechanics. The sun, the moon, how things move. He's trying to understand how they move. And of course, he's getting Islamic texts and written by the big names, which we discussed in the Rise and Fall of Science, particularly, Alhazen. And he looks, how Alhazen is studying celestial mechanics and decides to employ the method which he's using. Alhazen was looking at different things, but the method, the scientific method. So he uses the scientific method to try to understand, how planets are moving in the solar system. And he realized that the church had it all wrong. At this particular period of time, everybody thought that the sun was going around the earth, and all the other planets do. And through some really good, not quick, but really good experiments, right? Scientifically based experiments, he showed in this book and all of his works, it was indeed that everything rotates around the sun. And he actually built models of how things move in different directions and where they move and at what time of year. So he built this this wonderful working, scientific sort of a piece, this thought piece. And in it demonstrates how he did it utilizing science. That's the brilliant part. So by demonstrating how the method works, he literally reinvents science, for Europe. And that's why he's considered the father of modern science. That's something you don't want to forget. He is the father of modern science. 1543 on revolutions of heavenly spheres. I'll tell you what, it really made a bad outcry. The church was not happy with him looking at the rotation of the planets and figuring all this sort of stuff out. This Copernican view here just destroyed the old views of what the church was thinking about. And of course, that the church was gonna persecute him, probably kill him. He faced no persecution whatsoever. He was never touched by the church because he died shortly after the book was published. Poor guy. Yeah, or they would have killed him for sure. But the book hit so many different printing presses and was disseminated so widely that it couldn't be found and burned at all these locations. So it escaped that, and it became sort of the beacon of light that allowed sort of science to flourish again. And while this is astronomy, not life, it's still very important for people to start thinking scientifically and giving it some merits. And this really puts us on the map to becoming modern. Everything that we have in the world we have today can be probably traced back to this guy right here. He's so important. Okay. There's minor figures, which, they're interesting guys like Galileo. He's a really interesting guy. He's working with, he loved Copernicus and what he found. But Copernicus, the technology he had to use to track the planets wasn't optics. It had long rods and beams with little aim, like a gun sight, right? Where he would follow the planets around and get all the measurements on them. And it was very difficult to do. And you had to have the right conditions to see. It took years for him to make these measurements. And these instruments were huge, only 20, 30 feet long. And Galileo said, listen, I want everybody to be able to see this, to prove it to themselves, to do science. So he worked with local, glass grinders, and he produced the first telescope where you can just pick up, Galileo's book on the revolution of heavenly spheres and literally do it yourself. Watch the planets moving around and step by step, use science on your own. This was huge, what Galileo actually did. Was the church happy about this? Absolutely not. But here's the deal: they never killed Galileo either. And one of the reasons is he was pretty much a patrician or a rich guy. I mean, he just gave a lot of wealth away. He was a philanthropist, and everybody loved him. So when you go around killing someone that everyone loves, you're going to create a martyr. And they'd already done that with Joan of Arc, and they didn't want to do that again. So what they did was they just locked him up in his own house, and they never let him go, never let him out, never let anybody in until his death. And when he died, they dragged his body out and they buried him in a field, outside of town. It was really quite horrible. And in fact, it was so horrible that the church even had a hard time admitting it. In fact, it took them 350 years. And it was this guy right here, John Paul II, finally came up and said, you know what? I think that Galileo has suffered unjustly and we should be very sorry. And that we should be more tolerant towards the behaviors between science and religion, the relationship between them. And then it really did begin to change the church to begin a little bit, because the church cannot deny that look what we've done, our own self-determination. That's really what the alignment was about. You don't have to keep praying and asking for stuff, because after all, you keep doing that, nothing's happening. But when you get in and you do it yourself and you use your own mind, your own inventive quality, you utilize science and employ it, you can actually transform the world for the good. Now, the reconciliation for this is, of course, that there should be a relationship between science and religion, and that's really what our more modern popes have been trying to do too. But here is the real reality: is that everything we have in the world right now is the product of science, and the goodwill in which it produces. That's what I've just seen by the facts. Okay, all right. So let's go on. Now, there's other figures that, I don't want it to be too much of a laborious sort of history lesson, but, once science starts getting out and there's other free thinkers, such as William of Ockham, we've had a guy named by Francis Bacon in another location. And this guy, Francis Bacon, was seeing what science could actually do. And he's saying, yeah, in the universities, we really need to start working with inductive science, looking for the simple things, building bigger models, bigger theories, sort of explain the nature of reality. It's the only way we're going to get out of the world that we're in, the feudal world that we're in, creating a better world, and it did. And this sort of thinking actually turned into industrialism, turned into all the modern medicine in which we have right now. And this guy was an Anglican, a devout Anglican too. So, even if you harbor a really strong religious sort of worldview, which is great. It doesn't prohibit you from seeing, what science can actually do in employing science. They can be compatible because, if religion is supposed to bring out goodness in the world, then religion should be allowing other things to produce goodness in the world, and that is science. And guys like this, of course, actually saw that. All right, other figures that were doing things at the time, just to do a whirlwind tour here, Leonardo da Vinci, and he wasn't working with celestial mechanics, and planets. Da Vinci was working with life in itself. He was one of the first anatomists. And he bravely went into the human body. At this time period, you just didn't touch a corpse. You didn't cut people open. That was holy sacrosanct thing. You don't do it. You may let someone's blood out every once in a while, or something like that. That's as far as you go. This inner world was not to be looked at. That's like heresy. But at times of the Renaissance allowed a greater sort of thinking. And so we began to investigate the body, look and compare, the human bodies with other animals. So much similarities are being tracked and looked at or accounted for. People began to see humans a little bit differently. That we are different in some respect from other animals, but we're a lot the same. And that the entire animal kingdom around us can be systematically studied. And it was really, Leonardo that began it. He never went into high detail. These are some of the, the unique images in which he has here. And one of them, of course, is birth. He's tracking the fetus towards birth, which no one knew anything about. And he was looking at his growth and development, is purely a physical manifestation that happens, a biological manifestation. Taking all the magic and whatever that happens out of it and looking at it clearly from a developmental point of view. Later on, other figures, Vesalius, he becomes more bold. While Leonardo worked on his own, doing things like this in his own little, back room, Vesalius was a physician, and he just openly, dissects corpses. The first one he did was a female cadaver in his anatomy lab. He goes, "Okay, guys, I got to teach you something about the body. We need to open this corpse up so we can look at how the organs are here. If something goes wrong, we know what's happening." So he began to do this in public, and this was like a huge deal. The people were in the time where, oh my God, how horrible this is. What are they doing? But he had so much confidence that what he was doing was correct and right and trying to help people by understanding the anatomy. He changed the mind about how people even view themselves, right? It's less of a spiritual object, well, you may have some spirituality, but we're still biological objects, which are studiable. And we can actually apply, our own science to helping ourselves. And really, it was Vesalius that actually started us on that track, deeply going into the action of biology. And for anthropology, this is really a very important thing. So here's kind of these detailed images that Vesalius done. Just amazing. Look at how much, detail he's doing and how systematic that looks. Exactly how the organs are working together, the relationships, how things are placed together. And he was comparing this with, other animals such as pigs and dogs and horses, and looking at very similar processes that are happening with each of the organisms. And then he started realizing how close, we are, in this thing called kingdom animalia, the kingdom itself. Last couple little things here. That takes us in a different direction with biology, but so important. So this guy named Leeuwenhoek here, Anton von Leeuwenhoek, invented a microscope. Look at small things. You were actually able to see bacteria and protists, blood cells. And, when people were dying of diseases, nobody knew what was going on. You died of a bacterial infection. Nobody knew what the heck it was. You just died. Well, for the first time, he was able to take out samples and see, if someone was infected with something, determine the causes of death, right? Which gave us, a way in which to try to at least pursue ways of helping people by killing this world. But what else he did was showed us a world that never existed before in our minds. The idea of out of sight, out of mind. Humans looking with their gaze don't see all of this microscopic world around us, which are the largest number of living organisms on Earth that we can't see. So for Anton, it said this is what science can do for us, right? Really understand more deeply things that are not within our gaze and allow us to see different perspectives and determine our own self sort of, determination where we're going to be going, our own direction. Now here's a little copy of Leeuwenhoek's microscope. It's nothing big, right? They're really simple by our standards. Believe me, it was like the cell phone of its time. But what he was seeing was sort of miraculous. And here's why. This is what was really interesting. So if you read any biblical text, you're not going to read, you'll read all the things about animals and things in the world and stuff, but is there anything about microscopic organisms whatsoever by any character anywhere, right? See, this gives them the idea that where does knowledge come from? It's not coming from biblical text because there's nothing in there about the real world. It doesn't discuss it. You know, you have to discover it yourself. And that is a self-discoverable world right there when he starts recording this and he sees all these forms and he realizes that at this point that the knowledge in which we have doesn't come from old manuscripts that are written thousands of years ago. It was beginning for the first time. And he knew it, that they were in the forefront of a new enlightenment, a whole new enlightenment around the way the world sort of operated. And just about this time began this whole phase, which we do call the Enlightenment. And part of it was what Leeuwenhoek was doing here, you know, producing a microscope and looking at a whole different world, which was beyond our gaze. And we're going to see that too, because we're going to be investigating the evolution of our own bodies and how our bodies are put together by the microscopic world that exists within us, right down to our own cells and what's in the center of our cells, the DNA, the master sort of molecule, which guides our body's growth and development, as well as how it changes from generation to generation. And we'll see, you know, how Leeuwenhoek's work would eventually, you know, lead to this all-important thing for us so that we can actually understand our past at a great more resolution than anybody in this period would be able to. Of course, everything gets better. We get different sorts of microscopes. You know, even Galileo had a simple microscope, but it wasn't nearly as powerful as Leeuwenhoek's. And then, of course, we get, you know, better advances over here on the left-hand side. This is Robert Hooke's microscope. You know, better. It actually has a little oil lamp, so you can, you know, shine light on something. You can see it better. You know, gradual improvements are going to be happening all the time. Now, Robert Hooke, you know, just runs off Leeuwenhoek, makes it better, creates sort of a catalog of Micrographia, which is a catalog of all the organisms which he's finding, and just begins to develop, you know, catalogs and catalogs and catalogs of classes of small organisms. So he's classifying, you know, the microscopic world. Meanwhile, we're going to be classifying the macroscopic world. And these things are going to meet together to produce a wealth of knowledge about how there's an interrelation between the macroscopic world, which we live in, the microscopic world, which is part of us and which we don't see. And we'll be talking a little bit about that because it does have a lot to do with, you know, who we are right now as biological organisms and how that microscopic world has actually influenced our evolution. And we'll see that a little bit later in the course. Right? All right, so the last thing I want to say about Hooke is that we're going to be talking a little bit about geological processes and the evolutionary sort of evidence from the past, which are the fossils, right? The remains of dead organisms, which have literally turned to stone, and we'll talk about that process. Well, you know, what Hooke began to do is realizing when he's looking at all this proliferation of new species the world had never seen before, he started looking, you know, at clues to how this sort of could have come about. So he really did begin to sort of, you know, thinking about, you know, evidence, and he began to look at rocks and utilizing his microscope to look at rocks. And he was able to actually find little microscopic, you know, organisms in the past, and also the macroscopic big things that lived in the past. And one thing he really noticed is that there's a continuity. The things in the past sometimes look like things in the current times. They've changed. They're similar, but they've changed. And sometimes he sees living in the past that don't exist anymore, things have gone extinct. But he sees a continuity between the past and the present. And what he understands that life has changed. The process of life change, species change, organisms change. Now, for Hooke, this was a simple observation. He didn't tell us how they changed because he didn't know. The person that's going to tell us a little bit about how that changed and provide that evidence is a person that's going to be living a little bit after Hooke here, the star of our show, and that's Charles Darwin. He's going to put that all together for us. But Hooke did it quite a bit of time before Darwin comes on the scene. What's really interesting about this is that while our star of the show, Charles Darwin's going to figure this out, it's guys like Hooke, you know, Leeuwenhoek, you know, everybody that came before him that are paving the way for Darwin to think out of that box. So when we think about scientists now that are discovering great things, I mean, they're not brilliant on their own. It's because of people in the past that came before them that have paved the way to allow them to do it. And that's how science operates. So my job as a scientist is to bring you guys to a different level, right? A whole different level, so that you can go further than what my generation has done. And then your descendants go further than what you've done. That's our absolute quest. And it's our quest also in the science of anthropology. Right. So this last slide just really shows the process of modern science. I want to say a few more words about it that are very important. I've given you some general overviews of how it works. A couple of things here that I didn't talk a little bit about are, before we begin to sort of construct a hypothesis in modern science, we always do background research. And because there's a lot of knowledge out there already, so if you think about, if you see a cause and effect relationship or patterns, there's so much work that's been done on all sorts of things. You never know if that work hasn't been done before. So you're obligated to really look to see if it's been done before. You don't want to try to answer the question twice. Read background research. Next, what's missing in my previous discussions, or what do we do with once we've completed all of our experimentation and either we actually support our hypothesis or refute our hypothesis? Right down to the bottom, communicate our results. We are obligated to communicate our results. In other words, if we're doing an experiment, I mean, not just something that you dream up at your house, but if it's actually legitimately funded, public money generated sort of experiment, that you must, communicate what you found. Either you accepted, you support your hypothesis or you refute your hypothesis. It must be published for other people to see. It has to be. And that means journals out there must accept your work. You may not get into a high-ranking journal. They may, refer you to a lower journal, but sometimes you will have, everything that you do actually published. So I wanted to put that out there. Okay, the rest of it's pretty straightforward and stuff we've looked at before. Okay, so that's going to conclude the the Reclamation of Science. Now, really what we're doing up next is we're going right into Darwin, right? This is the central character. And we'll be looking at, some of the observations which he made and some of the transformations that he actually went through to allow him to conceive of, his theory of natural selection. And then we'll delve into what are the tenets of natural selection and exactly how does that work. So that'll be coming up in other lectures sort of soon. All right, I'll see you guys later.